The landing boat slammed hard against another wave, throwing 30 men into each other like dice in a cup. Sergeant Tommy Martinez gripped his M1 Garand tighter and swallowed down the bile rising in his throat. 22 years old, born and raised in Brooklyn, and he'd never been so scared in his life. But he'd die before he'd let these other men see it. The English Channel had turned mean overnight. 6-foot swells rolled under the flat bottom of the Higgins boat, and every man inside was paying for it. The smell of vomit mixed with salt spray and gun oil. In the grey dawn light, filtering down through the open top of the boat, Martinez could see faces around him. Pale, green, young. Too young for what was coming. Private First Class Johnny Walsh was pressed against Martinez's left shoulder, a skinny farm kid from Iowa who'd lied about his age to enlist. 19 now, but he'd been 17 when he signed up. His helmet was too big. It kept sliding down over his eyes, and he kept pushing it back up with shaking hands. "Sarge," Walsh said, barely audible over the roar of the diesel engine. "You think the Canadians are going through this too? I heard they're landing somewhere east of us." Martinez looked at the kid. Walsh had that expression soldiers get when they need to talk about anything, absolutely anything except what's about to happen in the next 5 minutes. "Yeah," Martinez said. "Juno Beach, I think. They'll have it rough, but we all will." "You think they're as good as us?" It was an innocent question. The kind of question you ask when you're 19 and you've been told your whole life that America is the greatest country on earth, that American soldiers are the toughest, the best trained, the most capable. Martinez believed it too. He was 22, not much older than Walsh, and he believed it with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been tested. "They're good soldiers," Martinez said. He had to raise his voice now. The engine was revving higher. They were getting close. "But we're going to show them how it's done. We're the best army in the world, Walsh. Don't forget that." Walsh nodded. He looked reassured. That was Martinez's job as a sergeant. Keep the men steady, keep them believing. Even when the boat was bucking like a wild horse and the naval bombardment ahead sounded like the end of the world. Martinez had read the briefing papers. He knew the plan. 5 beaches, Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold, Juno and Sword for the British and Canadians. The briefing officer had said the Canadians had an easier sector. Juno Beach was supposed to have lighter defenses than Omaha. Martinez had thought the Canadians were getting lucky. The Americans were getting the tough assignment because the Americans could handle it. He still believed that. 2 minutes, the coxswain yelled from the back of the boat. Martinez checked his rifle, checked his ammo, looked at the men around him and tried to project confidence he only partly felt. Corporal Davis from Tennessee was right in front of him. Davis was older, maybe 30, with a wife and 2 kids back home. He was gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles were white. "Davis," Martinez said, "you good?" Davis turned his head slightly. His face was grey. "Yeah, Sarge, I'm good." He wasn't good. Nobody was good. They were all terrified. But that was okay. Fear was normal. As long as they could function through the fear, they'd be okay. 30 seconds! Martinez could see the beach now, a strip of grey sand. Metal obstacles sticking up out of the water like broken teeth, smoke from the bombardment drifting across everything. And beyond the beach, the bluffs. High ground where the Germans were dug in. The ramp dropped with a metallic crash that sounded like a death sentence. Gunfire immediately ripped through the opening. Heavy machine gun fire. The distinctive crack of German MG-42s firing so fast they sounded like chainsaws. The naval bombardment hadn't worked. The Germans were still there, and they were very much alive. Davis stepped forward. He made it exactly 1 step off the ramp before the bullets found him. Martinez saw the impacts, 3 dark spots blooming across Davis's chest. The corporal's eyes went wide with surprise. He fell backward into the boat, dead before he hit the deck. "Go, go, go." Martinez shoved forward, stepped over Davis's body, and plunged into the water. It was deeper than he expected, waist deep, freezing cold. His combat pack suddenly weighed 100 pounds. His feet sank into sand, and he nearly fell. All around him, men were dying. The water started turning red. Bodies floated past. The beach was 400 yards away. It might as well have been 400 miles. Martinez tried to run, but the water fought him. Bullets snapped past his head with sounds like angry wasps. An explosion to his right sent up a geyser of water and sand. Walsh was beside him somehow. Martinez grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a wooden obstacle. They fell behind it, gasping. The noise was beyond description. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, men screaming, the sound of dying. Martinez risked a look around the obstacle. The beach was chaos. Hundreds of men trying to cross open sand while German machine gunners fired down from positions that should have been destroyed but weren't. Bodies everywhere. "Jesus Christ, Sarge," Walsh was shouting. "Jesus Christ. Stay down. Catch your breath. We move when I say." But moving forward seemed impossible. The German fire was too heavy, too accurate. Officers tried to organize attacks, but as soon as someone stood up and started giving orders, a German sniper would drop him. The whole invasion was on the verge of stopping right here. Martinez looked east, toward where he thought Juno Beach must be. Were the Canadians going through this too, or had they gotten lucky with their lighter defenses? The hours blurred together into a nightmare of fear and exhaustion. Slowly, painfully, the Americans began to move forward. Not because they were winning, just because staying on the beach meant dying on the beach. They crawled, they ran, in short, desperate bursts. They used bodies as cover. Martinez's platoon made it off the beach around mid-morning. They'd started with 30 men. 14 were still moving. They reached a small seawall at the base of the bluffs and collapsed behind it. Walsh's uniform was soaked with seawater and someone else's blood. His face had aged 10 years in 4 hours. The scared farm kid was gone. "Sarge," Walsh said quietly, "how many did we lose?" Martinez stared back at the beach, at the bodies in the water, at the wrecked landing craft. "Too many. Way too many." By late afternoon, Martinez's group had pushed about half a mile inland. It felt like a victory and a failure at the same time. They'd made it off the beach alive, but the cost had been staggering. Martinez was helping set up a defensive position when he saw them approaching. American soldiers from a different unit. They looked rough, bloody, exhausted, but they had something Martinez's group didn't: a long column of German prisoners. The officer leading them was a lieutenant, young but confident. He gave Martinez a casual salute. "Lieutenant Cooper, 116th Infantry. We're linking up with units on our flank. You guys from the 29th? "Yeah," Martinez replied. "Sergeant Martinez, hell of a day." "You can say that again." Cooper pulled out a canteen. "Listen, you guys linked up with the Canadians yet?" Martinez shook his head. "Canadians? They're supposed to be miles east of here," Cooper grinned. "Yeah, they were supposed to be. But those crazy bastards pushed so far inland so fast that they're actually ahead of us in some places. We ran into a patrol from the Canadian 3rd Division about an hour ago. They'd already cleared through 2 towns we were supposed to be taking tomorrow." Martinez stared at him. The words didn't make sense. "They what?" "Pushed inland. Like, really pushed. I talked to one of their sergeants. Said they'd had it rough on the beach, heavy casualties getting ashore. But once they broke through the coastal defenses, they just kept going. Didn't stop to consolidate, just kept attacking." Walsh spoke up. "How far did they get?" Cooper consulted a map. "Last I heard, elements of their 3rd Division were approaching Orthy. That's about 10 kilometers inland, maybe 6 miles. Compare that to where we are. We fought all day to get 1 mile off the beach. They fought all day and got 6 miles inland in some sectors." He looked at Martinez. Whether that's brilliant tactics or just crazy aggression, I don't know, but it's impressive as hell. The lieutenant moved on. Martinez stood there, watching him go. Around him, the other men were talking about what they'd just heard. Martinez felt something shift inside him, his certainty cracking. How could the Canadians have outperformed them? The Americans were the strongest force, the best equipped, the best trained. "Sarge, you think it's true?" Walsh asked. "I don't know," Martinez said. "Maybe their sector was easier." But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. That night, Martinez lay in a shallow foxhole and stared up at the stars. He kept thinking about what Cooper had said, 6 miles. The Canadians had advanced 6 miles, while the Americans were fighting for every yard. What if the Canadians knew something the Americans hadn't learned yet? The thought bothered Martinez more than he wanted to admit. It felt like a challenge to everything he believed, but it also felt like an opportunity. If the Canadians had figured something out, maybe the Americans could learn from them. Martinez made a decision. If he got the chance to work with Canadian units, he was going to watch them carefully. He was going to figure out what they were doing differently, and he was going to learn from it. His pride had taken a hit today. They'd expected to storm across France like an unstoppable force, and instead they'd barely survived getting off the beach. Meanwhile, the Canadians were leading the advance. It was humbling. And maybe, Martinez thought, humility was exactly what they needed right now. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, more chances to die or prove himself. But tonight, in the darkness, he let himself admit something he never would have said out loud. Maybe the Americans didn't have all the answers. Maybe they had something to learn, and maybe the Canadians were the ones who could teach them. The morning of June 9th arrived with fog rolling in from the Channel. Martinez's platoon had spent 3 days fighting inland, covering maybe 3 miles total. Every step had cost them. Martinez was down to 11 men now. They were moving through hedgerows near a village when Walsh raised his hand for halt. "Movement ahead, Sarge. Can't tell if it's ours or theirs." Martinez peered through the foliage. He could see figures on the other side. Then he heard English, not American English. The accent was different, flatter, Canadian. "Hold fire," Martinez said quietly. "They're friendly." The two groups met at a gap in the hedgerow, about 15 Canadians led by a sergeant who looked like he'd been soldiering since before Martinez was born. The man was stocky, maybe 5'9", with a thick mustache going grey and eyes that had seen too much. He limped slightly, favouring his left leg, and carried himself with casual competence. He extended his hand. "Sergeant McPherson, Regina Rifles, you Yanks look like you've had a rough go." Martinez shook it. "Sergeant Martinez, 29th Infantry. Yeah, you could say that. Omaha wasn't exactly a picnic." "Heard it was a meat grinder." McPherson pulled out cigarettes and offered them around. "We had our own troubles at Juneau, lost a lot of good lads getting ashore." Martinez studied McPherson while they smoked. The man radiated calm authority. His men were spread out properly, watching their sectors, weapons ready but not nervous. Professional. "I heard your units pushed pretty far inland on D-Day," Martinez said, trying to keep his tone neutral. 6 miles or so." "About that, yeah. We took heavy casualties on the beach, but once we broke through, our officers decided to keep the pressure on. Theory was, if we kept moving, kept hitting them before they could reorganize, we'd do more damage with less cost than if we let them dig in." "Did it work?" Walsh asked. McPherson took a drag. "Mostly. We took some towns, cleared positions, pushed Jerry back. But we also got hit pretty hard when we overextended, lost a lot of tanks at Orthy a couple days ago. The 12th SS Panzer Division caught us spread out and made us pay for it." His expression darkened. "Bastards killed some of our prisoners, just shot them. We found the bodies later." Martinez nodded grimly. "You get payback?" "We're working on it. Every time we run into those SS sons of bitches, we make them regret it." The two groups coordinated positions and shared information. As they worked, Martinez watched how the Canadians operated. The Canadian NCOs seemed to have more authority to make decisions. When McPherson gave an order, he often phrased it as a suggestion, and his men responded with initiative rather than blind obedience. Before they parted, Martinez asked, "How long have you been doing this? How long has your unit been in combat?" "This unit, we've been in England training since '41, but a lot of us fought in the First War. I was at WWII Ridge in '17, Passchendaele, the 100 Days. Martinez did the math. "That makes you 46. "Yeah.
Probably too old for this shit, but they needed experienced NCOs. Why'd you volunteer again, after going through the last war?"
McPherson looked at Martinez with those old eyes. "Because I saw what happened when we won the last war and didn't finish the job properly. We beat the Germans, but we didn't break them, so they spent 20 years building up for another try. This time, we're going to finish it properly." It was a perspective Martinez hadn't considered. For him, this was the First War. But for the Canadians, especially the older ones, this was unfinished business from 1917. Over the next week, Martinez's platoon operated near Canadian forces frequently. Martinez took every opportunity to observe. He noticed things, small things that added up. Canadian officers encouraged their sergeants to make tactical decisions on the ground. American officers kept decision-making authority for themselves. The Canadian approach meant faster reactions, more flexibility. Canadian units practiced combined arms constantly. Infantry, tanks, and artillery worked together like they'd been doing it for years. Which they had. 5 years of war had taught them lessons. Americans were just learning. The Canadians also studied terrain before attacking, looked for covered approaches, planned carefully. Americans tended to rely on firepower and momentum. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it got people killed. Martinez started keeping mental notes, things to try with his own squad, techniques to adopt. The Crossroads battle came on June 15th. American and Canadian forces would converge on a strategic intersection from 2 directions. Martinez attended the briefing in a ruined barn with officers from both armies. The Canadian officers ran the meeting differently, less formal, more willing to listen to NCOs, more flexible about adapting plans, but very clear about objectives and expectations. The attack kicked off at dawn. Martinez's platoon advanced on the left while a Canadian company took the right. They were supposed to meet at the crossroads, catching the Germans between them. The Germans had fortified it heavily. When the attack began, both forces immediately came under heavy fire. Martinez's platoon hit the dirt in a drainage ditch. They were pinned down, unable to advance. The lieutenant was trying to call for artillery, but the radio wasn't working. No help was coming. From his position, Martinez could see the Canadian company across the field. They were in similar trouble, but instead of waiting for support, they started maneuvering. Small groups would provide covering fire, while others advanced in short rushes. They weren't moving straight at the Germans, which would be suicidal. They were working around the flank, using every bit of cover. It was aggressive, risky, the kind of tactics that could work brilliantly or get everyone killed. "Sarge," Walsh said, pointing, "the Canadians are flanking them. Should we support?" Martinez made a quick decision. "Yeah. Second squad covering fire on those machine gun positions. First squad, we're advancing on the right. Try to link up with the Canadians. Move on my signal." His men responded immediately. Second squad opened up with concentrated fire. Martinez led first squad in rushes, moving from cover to cover, working closer to the Canadian position. A Canadian sergeant saw them coming and adjusted his movement to coordinate. Without any radio communication, just through mutual understanding, the two groups began working together to envelope the German position. 20 minutes of intense fighting, 20 minutes of controlled chaos, fire and movement, small unit tactics under pressure. Eventually, the combined force reached positions where they could assault from two sides simultaneously. The attack was quick and brutal. Germans, facing overwhelming fire from multiple directions, surrendered quickly. Afterward, a Canadian officer approached Martinez, younger than McPherson, probably late 20s, with captain's bars and a grin on his dirt-streaked face. "Good work there, Sergeant. That flanking maneuver wouldn't have worked without your support." "Same to you, sir," Martinez replied. "That was some aggressive movement under fire." The captain's grin widened. "We're encouraged to show initiative. Our training emphasizes that junior leaders should assess the situation and act rather than waiting for orders. Seems to work most of the time." They shared a canteen while their men organized defenses. Martinez asked questions. The captain answered them. They talked tactics, training, differences between how their armies operated. "Your men train differently than we do," Martinez observed. "Probably. I can tell you our approach." The captain lit a cigarette. "We emphasize combined arms coordination, small unit tactics, aggressive offensive action. We study what worked in the last war and what didn't. We learn from mistakes, quickly." He paused. "We also have the advantage of having fought continuously since '39. 5 years to work out the kinks. You Americans have only been at it for a couple years in this theater. You'll get there." It wasn't condescending, just an observation, and it was true. That night, Martinez sat with his men and talked through what they'd learned, how the Canadians had moved, how they'd coordinated, what they could adopt. Walsh spoke up, his voice more confident than a week ago. "They don't wait for perfect conditions. They see an opportunity and they take it." "Yeah," Martinez agreed, "but they're not reckless. They prepare as much as they can, then they act decisively." One of the men, a corporal named Jennings, added, "Their sergeants have more authority. That Canadian sergeant adapted his plan immediately when he saw us supporting. Didn't need permission." Martinez nodded. These were good observations. His men were learning too. The whole American army was learning, unit by unit, lesson by lesson. The night operation came 3 days later. A combined force tasked with taking a German position that controlled a key road junction. The plan called for infiltrating close under darkness, then launching a surprise assault just before dawn. The briefing was conducted by a Canadian major who laid out the plan with precision. Routes, timing, fire support, contingencies, thorough and professional. The combined force moved out at 2300 hours. 40 men, half American and half Canadian, slipping through darkness toward the German position. Martinez found himself paired with a Canadian corporal named Jacques Bouchard, a French-Canadian from Quebec who moved through the dark like a ghost. "You fight different than the British," Martinez whispered during a halt. Bouchard nodded in the darkness. "We learned from them, but we're not them. We're more aggressive, more willing to take risks. The British sometimes wait for everything to be perfect. We attack when the opportunity exists, perfect or not."
"That's more like how we operate," Martinez said. "Yes, but you sometimes attack without enough preparation. You rely on firepower and momentum. We try to combine preparation with aggression. Balance." The Canadians saw themselves as occupying middle ground between British caution and American boldness. Whether that was true or self-perception, Martinez couldn't say, but it seemed to work. The force reached the assault position an hour before dawn.
They lay in darkness, waiting, listening to German sentries talking 50 yards away. Martinez could hear his own heartbeat. The signal came, a whistle, barely audible. The entire force rose as one and charged. The surprise was total. Germans barely had time to react before they were overrun. The position fell in minutes with minimal Allied casualties. As dawn broke, Martinez stood in the captured trench looking around. American and Canadian soldiers working together, consolidating gains, treating wounded, securing prisoners. 2 different armies, but they'd just executed a complex night operation flawlessly because they'd learned to trust each other. "Not bad for a night's work, Sergeant," Bouchard said, appearing beside him with a grin. "Not bad at all, Corporal. Your guys know their business." "So do yours. Different style, maybe, but effective." By late June, stories filtered through about the Canadian fight for Caen. brutal, a grinding battle against Germany's best units. The Canadians were taking heavy casualties but kept advancing, kept pressuring. Martinez's respect grew daily. The Canadians weren't superhuman, they made mistakes. They suffered defeats, they lost men to bad luck and German fire just like everyone else. But there was a professionalism to how they operated. One thing impressed Martinez particularly: how Canadians handled casualties. They took care of their wounded aggressively, had well-organized medical evacuation, made sure dead soldiers were identified and buried properly. It seemed small, but it mattered to morale. Soldiers fought better knowing that if they were hit, they'd be taken care of. Martinez started adopting Canadian practices, encouraging initiative from squad leaders, studying terrain before attacking, coordinating more carefully with supporting arms. His platoon got better. Casualties decreased. Mission success increased. Other American units were doing the same, learning from the Canadians, adapting techniques that worked. The U.S. Army's strength had always been its ability to learn quickly. That strength was on full display in Normandy. By early July, Martinez had developed genuine friendships with Canadian soldiers: McPherson, whom he ran into periodically; Bouchard, who taught him infiltration techniques; others whose competence he respected. They weren't just allies anymore, they were colleagues, brothers in arms. The initial surprise at Canadian performance had evolved into respect, and respect had grown into something deeper. A recognition that they were all in this together, that they could learn from each other, that together they were stronger than either nation alone. Martinez no longer thought about which army was better. That question seemed childish now, irrelevant. What mattered was that both armies were getting better, learning, adapting, becoming more effective at defeating Germany. The education of Sergeant Martinez was well underway. And the teacher was an army from a northern country that everyone had underestimated, including Tommy Martinez from Brooklyn, who'd thought he had all the answers on June 6th. He knew better now. August arrived with heat and dust and the smell of death. The war had shifted. The desperate struggle to hold beaches had transformed into a war of movement. The Allies were pushing out, breaking through. The Germans were falling back, fighting vicious rearguards. Martinez's platoon was down to 8 men. Walsh was still there, no longer the scared farm kid. He was harder now, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. They were west of Falaise when news came through. The Canadians were closing a pocket, trapping 2 German armies trying to escape east. If the Canadians could hold, tens of thousands of Germans would be captured or killed. If the Germans broke through, they'd escape to fight another day. Martinez studied the map. His unit was 80 miles west, too far to help. But he found himself thinking about McPherson, about Bouchard, about all the Canadian soldiers he'd met. They were going to be in the middle of a desperate fight. "Wish we could be there," Walsh said quietly. "Yeah," Martinez agreed, "but they can handle it. They've been handling it since '39. Reports over the next days were grim. Germans were throwing everything at the Canadian positions: panzer divisions, SS units, desperate men facing death or capture. The Canadians were holding, but barely. Casualties were heavy. Martinez's unit was ordered to attack west to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the pocket. Hard fighting. The Germans fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. On August 15th, Martinez's platoon took a village after 6 hours of house-to-house fighting. They'd lost 2 men, including Jennings, the corporal who'd made that observation about Canadian sergeants, hit by a sniper, dead before he hit the ground. Martinez was sitting on destroyed church steps, exhausted and filthy, when he heard vehicles. American trucks carrying supplies forward, but one had passengers. Canadian soldiers headed east to rejoin their units. Martinez stood up, and there, climbing down from the back, limping worse than before, was McPherson. The Canadian sergeant saw Martinez and grinned. "Martinez, you Brooklyn bastard, what are you doing out here?" Martinez crossed the street and gripped McPherson's hand. Could ask you the same, old man. Thought you'd be at Falaise. Got wounded 3 days ago, shrapnel in the leg. McPherson gestured at his pronounced limp. They patched me up and are sending me back. Can't keep a good Canadian down. They sat on the church steps. McPherson pulled out his cigarette pack, and they smoked in comfortable silence. Around them, soldiers moved with purposeful chaos, American and Canadian working side by side like it was natural. "How bad is it at Falaise, WWII?" Martinez asked. McPherson's expression darkened. "Bad. Real bad. Jerry's trying to break out, and we're trying to keep the pocket closed. It's a meat grinder. We're losing a lot of good men." He paused. "But we're holding. Every hour we hold, more Germans get trapped." "You going back into that?" "Have to. My boys are there." McPherson looked at Martinez with those old eyes. "You understand. You do the same." Martinez did understand. Your men were fighting, so you fought with them. Simple as that. "Listen," McPherson said, reaching into his jacket. "I want you to have something, just in case." He pulled out a photograph, creased and faded from being carried in his breast pocket for weeks. It showed maybe 20 soldiers standing in front of a damaged building. Martinez remembered the day it was taken, mid-July, D-Day plus 37. Some soldier had found a camera and they'd all posed together, Americans and Canadians laughing despite the war. Martinez could see himself in the photo, younger and less scarred than he felt now. Next to him stood McPherson, grinning. On the back, in McPherson's handwriting, D-Day plus 37, July 13th, 1944, the best allies a man could ask for. "You keep this," McPherson said, pressing it into Martinez's hand. "Reminder of what we built here, what we learned from each other." Martinez tried to hand it back. "You should keep it. I've got my memories. You keep the photo." McPherson stood, wincing at the pain in his leg. "Besides, I'll see you after we close this pocket. We'll have a proper drink. Tell lies about our exploits." They shook hands. Martinez watched as McPherson climbed into the truck. The Canadian sergeant gave him a casual salute as the vehicle pulled away, heading east toward the sound of heavy fighting. Martinez never saw him again. The Falaise pocket closed on August 21st. The victory was complete, but it came at terrible cost. 3 days later, Martinez learned that McPherson had been killed on August 19th. His unit had been holding a critical position when German tanks tried to break through. McPherson had stayed at his post, directing fire, keeping his men steady, until a shell from a German tank ended it. He died doing what he'd been doing for 30 years. Leading men in combat, holding the line, finishing the job. Martinez sat alone in a foxhole when he heard the news, holding that photograph. For the first time since Omaha Beach, he cried. Not just for McPherson, but for all of it. For Davis, who died on the ramp. For Jennings, killed by a sniper. For all the good men who'd paid the price for liberating Europe. The reports from Falaise told the full story of what aggressive tactics cost. The Canadians had closed the pocket, trapped 2 German armies, destroyed hundreds of tanks and captured tens of thousands of prisoners. It was a strategic masterpiece, but the butcher's bill was staggering. The same aggression that had pushed them 6 miles inland on D-Day, the same relentless offensive spirit that McPherson had embodied, had driven them to hold positions at Falaise that should have been abandoned. They'd paid for that ground in blood. Martinez understood now what McPherson had meant back in June about getting hit hard when they overextended at Orthy. It wasn't a complaint, it was recognition that aggressive tactics came with a price. The Canadians knew that price and paid it anyway because the strategic gain was worth the tactical cost. That was the difference Martinez had been trying to understand. The Canadians didn't just fight aggressively because they were bold. They fought aggressively because they'd calculated that offensive action even with higher immediate casualties, saved lives in the long run by ending the war faster. It was hard calculus, brutal mathematics of war, and it had cost them McPherson, along with thousands of other good men, but it had also closed the Falaise Gap and destroyed 2 German armies. Walsh found Martinez an hour later. The kid sat down beside him without saying anything. They sat together in silence, the way soldiers do when words aren't enough. "He was a good man," Walsh finally said. "Best I ever knew," Martinez replied. By September, the Allied armies had liberated most of France and were approaching the German border. The rapid advance was slowing as supply lines stretched and German resistance stiffened. But the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Martinez's unit was pulled off the line in late September for rest and refit. They'd been in continuous combat since D-Day, and the survivors were exhausted. They were sent to a rest area in Belgium where real food, hot showers, and actual beds awaited. It felt surreal. Martinez spent the first day sleeping, 16 hours straight. When he woke, he felt almost human again. The rest area was shared by multiple units, including Canadian forces also rotating out. Martinez found himself looking for familiar faces. Some he found, some he didn't. The math of combat was cruel and simple. He met Roy MacDonald on the 3rd day. MacDonald was a Canadian private, maybe 25, from the North Shore Regiment. They'd landed on Juno on D-Day. They got to talking at the makeshift canteen over weak beer. "You're Martinez?" MacDonald asked. "From the 29th? "Yeah, how'd you know?" "McPherson mentioned you, said you were a good soldier, said the Americans were learning fast." The mention of McPherson hit hard. Martinez took a drink to cover it. "McPherson was one of the best. I learned a lot from him." "He learned from you too," MacDonald said. "He told me the Americans had this optimism, this belief they could win, said it was infectious. Said we Canadians had gotten cynical after 5 years of war, and you Yanks reminded us why we were fighting." It was a perspective Martinez hadn't considered. He'd spent so much time learning from the Canadians, he hadn't thought about what they might have learned from Americans. Maybe it went both ways. Maybe Canadian professionalism and American optimism complemented each other. They talked for hours, comparing experiences, D-Day stories, names of men they'd lost, battles they'd survived. 2 soldiers from different countries who'd fought the same war. "What impressed me most about you Americans," MacDonald said after several beers, "was your confidence. You really believed you could win, not just hoped, but actually believed it. That kind of certainty is powerful." "What impressed me about you Canadians," Martinez replied, "was your professionalism. You'd been doing this for years, you had it figured out, and you shared that knowledge instead of keeping it to yourselves." MacDonald raised his glass. "To the partnership, then, to learning from each other." "To the partnership," Martinez agreed. They drank to that. 2 soldiers acknowledging something important. The alliance wasn't just about shared enemies or political agreements. It was about mutual respect earned through shared hardship. It was about teaching and learning. It was about becoming better together. The war continued for another 8 months. Martinez fought through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine into Germany itself. He encountered Canadian units periodically. The working relationship deepened with each encounter. When the war ended in May 1945, Martinez was in Germany, part of the occupation force. He'd survived, though not unchanged. The war had marked him physically with scars and mentally with memories that would never fade. But he'd learned things that would stay with him forever. He'd learned humility, that his country, for all its strengths, didn't have all the answers. He'd learned respect for any professional soldier who knew their job and did it well, regardless of nationality. Most importantly, he'd learned about partnership. Real partnership wasn't about one side being better. It was about combining strengths, compensating for weaknesses, learning from each other. Martinez returned to Brooklyn in fall 1945. He got a job, started building a civilian life, but the war stayed with him. He'd left Brooklyn as a confident young man who thought he knew everything. He'd come back understanding how much he had yet to learn. Years passed. Martinez got married, had children, built a career. He attended veteran reunions. Walsh came to visit once. He'd done well, married, 3 kids, teaching at a high school. He'd named his second son Gene, after the Canadian medic who'd saved his life. "I never forgot," Walsh said quietly. "The Canadians taught us a lot, more than just tactics." In 1975, Martinez made a trip to Canada. He'd been corresponding with Roy MacDonald for years. MacDonald had invited him to Toronto for a D-Day veterans reunion. Martinez went with his wife and 2 teenage children. The reunion was held at a Veterans Affairs building, crowded with old soldiers telling old stories. Martinez walked in and felt immediately at home. These were his people. He found MacDonald easily, grayer and heavier but still recognizable. They embraced like old friends. "Martinez, damn good to see you." They spent the evening together with a dozen other veterans, American and Canadian. Stories flowed as freely as beer. D-Day, the hedgerows, Falaise. Someone mentioned McPherson, and several men raised their glasses in silent tribute. Later, Martinez stood outside smoking. MacDonald joined him. "You know what the real victory was," MacDonald said. "Not beating Germany, that was necessary, but the real victory was this." Oh, he gestured at the building behind them, building something that lasted beyond the war, a partnership built on mutual respect. Martinez nodded slowly. "I thought the Canadians were going to be junior partners, smaller country, smaller army. I thought we'd be teaching you. And we thought we'd have to show the brash Americans how it's done," MacDonald admitted with a grin. "Turns out we both had something to learn." "We still do," Martinez said. "World's getting complicated. We'll need each other in whatever comes next." Martinez died in 1998 at age 76. His children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, listening to stories about a quiet, thoughtful man who never talked much about the war. While clearing out his belongings, his daughter found a small wooden box in the back of his closet. Inside was a faded photograph. 20 soldiers, American and Canadian, standing together in France in summer 1944. Her father was easy to spot, young and lean, rifle slung over his shoulder. Next to him stood an older man with a thick moustache, grinning. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, D-Day plus 37, July 13th, 1944, the best allies a man could ask for. Below that, in her father's familiar script, McPherson was right, they were. She showed it to her brother David. "Dad never talked much about the war," he said, but when he did, he always spoke highly of the Canadians, said they taught him everything important. What did they teach him? David thought about it. Humility, I think, and respect. That success isn't about being the best, it's about learning from others. The photograph was framed and given a place of honor at the funeral. Old veterans who attended studied it with knowing eyes. One old man, probably in his 80s, pointed at McPherson. "I knew him," the old man said quietly. "Sergeant McPherson died at Falaise, hell of a soldier." "You're Canadian?" David asked. "Yeah, North Shore Regiment. We worked with your father's unit a few times." The old man smiled. "Your father was a good man, open-minded, willing to learn. That meant something." After the funeral, David did research. He learned about D-Day, about the Canadian advance from Juno Beach, about the partnership between American and Canadian forces. He learned about Vimy Ridge and the First World War, about why Canadians fought with such determination in the Second. He learned his father had been part of something important. Not just defeating Germany, but building an alliance that transcended national pride. An alliance built on recognition that no country has all the answers, that strength comes from combining different perspectives. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, David traveled to Normandy. He visited Omaha Beach, walked the sand his father had crossed under fire. He also visited Juneau Beach, where Canadians had landed and pushed 6 miles inland on that first desperate day. At the Juneau Beach Center, he met Ian McPherson, son of the sergeant his father had known. Ian was there for anniversary commemorations representing his father's regiment. The two men discovered their connection and spent hours talking. "Your father and mine were good friends," Ian said. "My father wrote letters home about him, said Martinez was one of the Americans who understood what we were trying to do, said he was willing to learn instead of assuming Americans had all the answers." "My father kept that photograph until he died," David replied. "I think your father meant a lot to him." They stood together at the Juneau Beach Memorial, looking out at the water. 60 years had passed. The men who'd fought there were old now, dying off year by year. Soon there would be none left who remembered. But the lessons endured. The partnership endured. "To the best allies a man could ask for," David said quietly, echoing the words his father had lived by. "To the best allies," Ian agreed. They stood in silence, two sons honoring fathers who'd fought, and the partnership those fathers had built. The waves rolled against the Norman shore, the same waves that had carried the Higgins boats 60 years before. Somewhere in the wind off the channel was the echo of old voices, soldiers calling to each other in combat, Americans and Canadians learning from each other how to survive, how to fight, how to win. Tommy Martinez from Brooklyn had started the war believing Americans were the best. He'd ended it knowing that best was the wrong question. The right question was, how can we learn from each other? That question, and the answer two armies found together in summer 1944, had outlasted the men who asked it. It had become a legacy, passed from fathers to sons, preserved in faded photographs and quiet remembrances. McPherson had written it in 1944. Martinez had carried it until 1998, and now in 2004 their sons stood together on a French beach, bearing witness to a truth learned in blood and fire. Some partnerships, forged in war, transcend everything else. This was one of them.